Very good evening. You're watching the Urban Debate. I'm Afrida Rahman Ali. A nearly 60% rise in the price of crude oil in the past 1 year has directly contributed to fuel rates in India reaching record highs. This is a subject that we have been talking about for months now here on Mirror Now. Remember, India is dependent on imports of crude to meet around 85% of the domestic requirements. The country imports roughly 226 metric tons of crude oil every year. Now, despite a cut in the central excise duty announced recently, 5 rupees per litre on petrol and 10 rupees per litre on diesel, fuel prices across major metros in India continue to be significantly high. Now, in the national capital, for instance, petrol is still selling for 104 rupees per litre, diesel is at 86.7 rupees per litre. And just to give you a perspective, this has gone up 28% and 22% respectively from a year ago. So why are we discussing this today? Well, a big development that we are looking at today is to understand the important announcement that was made. For the very first time ever, India is set to release 5 million barrels of crude oil from its strategic petroleum reserves. So this is part of a global coordinated effort by major countries to release millions of barrels of crude oil reserves in order to control soaring oil prices. Is it a good strategy? Is it a bad strategy? We'll try to understand that. But apart from India, yes, countries like US, China, Japan, South Korea and Britain are also set to release crude oil from their reserves. In fact, the Biden government is planning to release as much as 50 million barrels from its strategic reserves. So what do we know so far? Let's put it out for our viewers straight away. What we do know is that a release of 5 million barrels of crude oil would equate to about 12.8% of the total strategic reserves that India has, which is 5.3 million tons of crude oil, estimated to be equivalent to 9.5 days of crude oil requirement. That's our total reserve. Out of this, 5 million barrels, which is roughly equivalent to a day's consumption in our country, is set to be released. Well, two other things we need to put in context. First, the OPEC plus countries has been slow to restore production levels after it imposed a supply cut of 10 million barrels per day in April 2020, when the price of Brent crude fell to an 18-year low of under 20 rupees per barrel due to the impact of COVID. That's one. The second point that we also need to, of course, highlight is that since hitting a low of 16 rupees per barrel on the 22nd of April last year, the price of Brent crude oil has been increasing steadily, touching a high of $86.67 per barrel on the 25th of October. Ever since, though, the prices have come down. Now it's come down below $80 per barrel after US gave indications that oil will be released from its reserves. So sure enough, that has happened. Now we come to our big question. Can this move provide further relief to consumers in India after the government recently cut excise duty on petrol and diesel and few states have cut VAT? So this comes after months of spiraling fuel prices. We have to understand what is in it for you and me. We've been hit by the rising prices, not just petroleum products. Across commodities, prices are on the rise. So let's introduce, joining us this evening to discuss all of these issues and to put things in perspective for us, to give us clarity on whether this is a decision prudent enough for a country like India or not. Dr. Ami Yagnik, Member of Parliament of the Rajya Sabha from the Congress Party, is with us. Gopal Agarwal, National Spokesperson of the BJP. Saket, Mishra, Economist. Amirullah Khan, Economist. And also Ajay Dua, former Secretary, Government of India, is with us. Okay, I am told I don't have Mr. Gopal Krishna as yet. We will have him shortly, I'm hoping. Okay, I want to first begin by getting the economics straight on this. So I'm going to begin with the experts on the show to understand the merits of this decision. So let's head on with the question that I started the show with. What is in it for us? Let's have Mr. Saket Mishra and Amirullah respond to you. First, Mr. Saket Mishra, go ahead and tell us, explain to us the economics behind this. How will this help you and me, the end consumer, that is reeling under the burden of rising fuel prices?
I think it's just, this is more a statement of intent by the US and all the big consuming countries what it is telling the OPEC plus world is that the consuming countries are not going to be bullied. It also shows intent by the US, which actually has a large number of national producers within the US, that they will be ramping up their production. And it's a subtle signal given all the other strategic relationships that the US has with the big oil producing countries, especially in the GCC, that they're serious about the negative impact that this is having on the global recovery, and that they expect OPEC to speed up the process of production. So yes, this may have some amount of temporary reduction impact in terms of the oil prices globally, but the real impact will be seen, I would say, over the next 2 months, where the intent turns into OPEC actually responding to it.
Okay, yes, that's right. Of course, we are yet to see whether OPEC countries respond to it or not. Amirullah Khan, do you concede with that view? Because we want to understand that how will this translate into a reduction in prices in petroleum products here in India? Is this move directed towards that end? What are your thoughts, sir?
Thanks to Saket Mishra for making that point very clear. I'd just like to add to that, saying that it's important to note that this measure is not a measure that will drive crude oil prices down. What it might do is to prevent a further increase. Secondly, as Saket put it very well, this is the US flexing its muscle, asking OPEC to behave. Thirdly, you see, the timing of this decision, this international decision, is such that it is happening at a time when oil demand is going to be very high. You see, for obvious reasons, winter is when fuel prices go high, because fuel demand goes high in countries which use a lot of heating. So what's going to happen in the next couple of months with the winter setting in is an increased demand in fuel, and that increased demand is bound to push up prices, and that is what the US wants to prevent. However, it is therefore um, uh, a far-fetched opinion to think that this will actually help in any reduction in prices for us in India. Your direct question, I'm answering it directly, that that to expect that this release of reserves is going to dip our prices is really not going to be seen. What it definitely means, as Saket said, it's an intent. And look at the amount of fuel that we are going to release. It's really 1 day's reserve, and the other side of it is very serious, because if we are going to dip into our reserves right now, then God forbid, if there is a real problem later on, then what are we going to do? See, what we should realize very clearly is that India's fuel prices have very little to do with crude oil prices. India's oil prices and the hikes there have everything to do with the high amount of taxation on fuel. And that is because a government that doesn't have too much money, or is actually starving for funds, is looking at oil taxes to shore up its tax revenue. Unless that is rationalized, we will not see a real dip in prices. So in summary, this is a measure that is part of an international measure to convey some kind of a disfavor to OPEC. It has very little local impact.
Important points that you made, sir, about the kind of impact that it can have locally, domestically on prices. It's a far-fetched thought. You're saying that it's presumptuous. And also you're saying, of course, this has been a continuous argument that the prices can be controlled by the central government if they wish to do so, by reducing excise further. The international crude oil price is not the only factor. This has been a raging argument, of course. Dr. Ami Yagnik, I would understand that, at least you would be happy that the government is moving in this direction. There's been a clamor to reduce prices of petroleum products. Do you agree or support this move that the government of India has taken, which many believe is part of a concerted effort to listen to the woes of the people to reduce the prices of petrol and diesel?
Well, if you see the announcement that has been made by the government is absolutely following a US decision, and it is in tandem with US decision. And US, in fact, has told three countries, it's I think India, China and Japan, to release its reserve oil. Whatever number we have agreed to, some 5 million barrels, our total reserve is 38 million barrels. Out of that, we are going to release some 5 million barrels as a from the strategic reserve. But for what? You are trying to cool off international prices. So when we are talking about the local price or the local impact or within the country impact, what will be for the Aam Aadmi, I think it hardly matters in a sense. And when you are trying to use the strategic reserves, and that too also, which would come to only for a day, I do not know what is the rationale behind such a decision without, I think, going for any reform measure, very kind of, I would say, structural change in our taxation, this would not have that impact on the local fuel prices. So when we are talking about Aam Aadmi, I think that is not going to help.
Okay.
As you have also heard the experts speak on this, definitely it is kind of international driven thing, and then the dates have not yet disclosed. They are going to finalize on that, and it is also going to finalize later on how they are going to come to this cooling international prices, whether it is going to help at all. And especially when after the pandemic, I think there has been a rise in the use of the fuel, and there is not fall in the fuel prices. So that depends on how now the government in this changing time, the changing consumption pattern is going to make a change in its structural taxation structural structure, and that is very important as far as India is concerned. But
Okay.
I do not think there is going to be any major change, because I think the government needs to look into this aspect very, very seriously.
Okay, Ajay Dua wants to respond to Ami Agnik. I also would like to have the BJP spokesperson respond to some of the points raised there. But Ajay Dua, you first.
Thank you, Farida, for having me on your show.
Pleasure.
I'd like to just explain a little bit. The move is at the behest of the government of the United States. That is, the United States took the initiative and roped in 4 other major consumers: China, India, in that order, Japan, and Korea. And in all likelihood, United Kingdom is also joining in. So with 6 large consumers, it might appear that the cut of 5 million barrels by India,
Yes.
released by the United States, 50 million barrels, is small, but it is the first time that the consumers are getting together. United States had effected a cut when the war with Libya took place in 2012. They released from its strategic reserve. We hadn't. I think the message to go down to the OPEC countries is that you cannot be unmindful of the people who buy your product. So far it was being looked at as a supplier's market. Now, if 6 countries and maybe 6 plus some others act in tandem, it is certainly going to match or make the OPEC countries say what will happen. The fact that all these countries put together, they have a 15 days reserve. India has 9 to 10 days. United States has more. Average in the world is today 15 days reserve they have. Some amount of winter heating, etc., can be met from that. So the point I'm trying to make, Farida, is we need to formalize the consuming countries forming a collective of theirs, exactly like OPEC. Let it be OPEC, oil producers instead of oil producers, the consumers.
Oil consumers. Very important and interesting point. In fact, I was meaning to ask you this, that this is like now become the oil buyers club and their time to flex some muscles and sending out a message to the supplying countries, to the OPEC countries, the oil producing countries that they cannot have a say on this all the time. That's an interesting point. Yes, Gopal Krishna ji, I want to ask you that, a couple of points being made about dipping into the strategic reserves. To many, that would sound like a desperate move. Is it a last resort? What if a real problem happens? Why are we parting with our reserves, Mr. Gopal Krishna?
Afrida, we have to understand that it is not an isolated step that the country is taking. When the Congress MP said that it is one of a step, but we have to understand that the government is taking multiple steps. We have reduced the excise. Most all the states ruled by the NDA government have reduced VAT. We have been requesting Congress ruled states also to opposition ruled states to reduce VAT. They have refused. Only 1 or 2 states have done it. One thing. Second thing is the Prime Minister has said that ultimately we have to come to a stage where we have to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, coal, oil, etc. And Government of India is taking strong steps towards solar energy. Even hydrogen mission has been set so that hydrogen energy is unleashed. Then we are also working on electric vehicles, hydropower energy. So the thing is that renewable energy is one way forward. That is important, and our
but here the proportion, sir, is too low, isn't it? I mean, here, like the other experts on the panel are saying, it's just about joining US's agenda and just about joining that club and saying we are also part of it. But in terms of real numbers, this is only, it looks only symbolic that yes, we are parting with a day and a half's, a requirement, oil requirement for this country. But then I want to ask you that, it's being said that the government is trying to get its act together ahead of the crucial state elections. This is looked at as part of a diplomatic sort of a conglomerate that has decided to take a decision. In real terms, Mr. Gopal Krishna, when and how will it translate into a relief for the end consumer, for the Aam Aadmi?
No, already if you see the government has taken a strong measure on the excise duty cut and VAT cut, and it has released almost 88,000 crore rupees in the hands of the common man. And we are also looking into the inflation aspect of the things. As the direct and indirect tax collection are increasing, government is also reducing its dependence on the resource generation from the oil. So what I'm telling you is the oil is an important part of the energy component.
No, but how will it reduce dependence? I'm sorry, Mr. Agarwal, I didn't get that point. Are we going to continue to reduce our dependence by dipping into our reserves? Is that an option?
No. It is one of the steps that the government is taking. It is we also want to import from Iran. There are issues in the rupee trade. So
okay.
We are also negotiating with UAE and other Gulf countries to increase their production and export. So what I'm telling you is this is not the single step that the government is taking. It's a multiple steps that we are taking. Ultimately, we have to move our dependence from fossil fuel to renewable energy. That is the long-term road we have to take. And at the short term, we have to fight the inflation where petroleum prices can generate further inflation. That is one concern, that government is therefore reducing excise and VAT. That is one thing. Then another form of renewable energy. So multi-pronged strategy and solidarity with which other panelists have been saying that solidarity with the oil consuming nations is also important. So this alone step will not help completely reduce our dependence on oil.
But people are restless, Mr. Gopal Krishna Agarwal, for some real advantage out of this move. The muscle flexing, the solidarity part is all okay when it's all diplomatically sound, perhaps. But the people on ground is asking whether this will translate into some sort of a relief for the consumer. I would like to go across to Mr. Saket Mishra, since you raised this point about, how dipping into the reserves may not always be a good idea. And what if it backfires? What if it still doesn't yield the desired result, Mr. Mishra?
I mean, just to correct, I didn't say it was a bad idea at all. I think it's important for India to be in solidarity with the US. And what we have actually released
No, but you
is
did
not
say
really.
that it may not necessarily lead to
Yes, yes, that is true.
reduction
That
in,
is
yeah,
true.
sorry, I meant
That's
that.
true.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Correct. Yeah. So as I said, I think it's a question of intent. I do think that all these countries coming together, as Mr. Dua also said, will make an impact in terms of ensuring that OPEC realizes the seriousness. And again, I mean, there is some justification in terms of what OPEC has been doing, right? They have been burnt because it's very hard for them to reduce production capabilities if, let's say, a third wave of COVID comes around. So there's been hesitation from that. And I think there is also a parallel dialogue that's happening between the consuming countries and OPEC, saying that, look, we are seeing a relatively stable level of demand. Therefore, it's prudent for you to actually increase production. I would also, I think it's very important to not tiptoe around an issue that that Amirullah ji was talking about earlier, which is that we also need to look at the other side of the equation, right? Everybody needs money. Where is that money being used? Now, if we are continuing as a governance set up in this country, going to continue to offer freebies irrespective of need, but more focused on voting blocks, I think we will continue to struggle in terms of our fiscal prudence. And that is, it is not just a question of reducing excise here, because eventually money has to come into the government at all levels, state or central, right? So we need to also be looking at re-examining where are we spending this money? Is it being productively spent? Is it being sent for votes, or is it being sent for people who actually need it? What is the leakage from the money that gets spent? So I think there are both sides of the equation, and eventually in the long run, as we in parallel move towards renewable energy, we also need to look at our ability to reduce the taxation levels on energy products by improving the efficiency of our spending.
Yes. So, Amirullah Khan, do you agree that, it should not be such a big deal if we are dipping into our reserves? After all, we are anyway poised to look for alternatives to alternative fuels. So we are already moving in that direction. So perhaps, this should not be looked at as such a big threat to our needs in that respect. Please respond to the points that were made just now, Mr. Amirullah Khan.
Yeah, a few things, Afrida. First is that this doesn't seem to be part of some overall strategy, and that's the big worry. That it just seems to be some muscle flexing, and that we are now joining a group that is flexing its muscle. So that is the first problem. The second problem, and it
no,
is
but why is it a problem?
important.
Why do you call it a problem? Like, if we are part of the oil-consuming nations and we are taking coordinated, collaborative efforts
Let me explain
to be part of the decision-making process, why is it so wrong?
Afrida, if you look at literature on consumers flexing muscle when they do not have choices, it never works. You see, look at this as a pure negotiation strategy. There is a group of consumers who must buy oil, 85% of their requirement of oil, in conditions which are where they are going to head into very rough weather not being a pun, but actually. So where is the choice? The OPEC countries realize that right now they have a steady demand. They have a demand that is being met by their increasing supply and increasing prices because the demand is high. Therefore, they know that the consumers have no choice. If the consumer flexes his or her muscle, saying, I am not going to buy bread today, the bread manufacturer knows that she needs bread tomorrow. So therefore, what happens when any such consumer block comes up, and mind you, especially when there is no choice, then the producer really just smiles away. That is my problem. That is what I'm saying. The reason I'm saying that muscle flexing alone is not enough is because it seems to be a one-off measure which is not part of a grand strategy as far as India is concerned. Secondly, it is coming at a situation when there is really no choice for us but to buy oil from OPEC. The third problem, and that is again a problem of overall strategy, is that, where are the measures that we are seeing that will in the long run reduce our dependence on oil? There is nothing that you can see on any move towards public transport. Everybody is talking about more and more private transport. Talk about any infrastructure spending that is going to improve the public transport situation in India, and I can stick my neck out and say that I can't see anything there. The final issue is that if we are going to look at this problem in seriousness, then we must stop making irresponsible statements. You see what happens, and that's a big political problem in this whole issue. That is that we have always talked about how our government is going to reduce petrol price. Then you're caught. You see, what is happening right now is that because, there has been a constant clamor saying the previous governments were irresponsible, they allowed petrol prices to go up. Now those chickens are coming to roost. And now there is pressure on you when everything else is not working for the reduction in prices. Now there is pressure to reduce the price situation. And to do that by a bevy of measures which hardly have an impact on the final price, it is going to add that further pressure, further political pressure on a government that is already facing a lot of criticism. That is why I'm saying that this measure really doesn't look like
You are
it has
saying
it
you are
holds
not
great promise.
convinced. You are saying you are not convinced that enough efforts are being made in the other direction to reduce dependence on crude. Ajay Dua, where do you stand
Any
on this?
evidence?
Do you agree that India doesn't have that kind of bargaining power at the moment to flex muscles? And, reducing dependence on crude oil is a tall order at the moment, do you think?
Afrida, I'm afraid I'm with my fellow economists, I'm a little bit at variance.
Okay.
I'm quite optimistic. I concede whatever has been said by Saket Mishra as well as Amirullah Khan Sahab about that efficiency of use of money and the need for being practical rather than making only political talk, etc. This, I'm on a larger issue that for too long, the petroleum producers have had a free run. The fact that now the consumers are getting together and India has very willingly, because it's the third largest importer, joined the other consumers. And all right, it is the winter, demand will increase. But there is COVID now emerging, strong wave of COVID emerging in Europe. The demand for with all the restrictions, etc., demand for petroleum will come down. If one side heat increases it, the other side, this might neutralize it or even bring it down. The fact is, what is India's appealing? A very responsible statement has been made by the oil ministry yesterday and is reported today, saying all that we are seeking is reasonableness and responsible behavior, conduct on behalf of the oil producers. I think it's a very well measured response, and take it from me that oil, and I have a little bit of knowledge of this industry. I won't say I'm a domain expert per se. It costs $5 a barrel to produce it. Even at $20, when it was selling in April 20, when the price came down, when COVID came in, yet they were raking in, their countries as well as the producers were raking in profits. Now at $85, what did we see? As soon as the first move came from $85, Brent price I'm talking about, not WTI, it came down to $78, international price. Spiked up to $80 yesterday, late last evening, because the market expected much higher order of reserves to be released by the governments than what actually happened. But the point I'm trying to make is, if in the US, and US has not seen this kind of inflation in prices of, starting with petroleum, yesterday's retail price in the US, and it's almost equal in every state, was $3.41 to a gallon, which is probably the highest.
So on the point of raking in profits, Mr. Dua, I want to again, pick up from where you left and actually tell our viewers why you are saying this, just to put it in perspective. In 2020, the government had increased central excise duties on petrol by 13 rupees per litre and on diesel by 16 rupees per litre as part of the efforts to shore up revenue during the pandemic. So attributing the rise of petroleum products solely to international crude oil prices does not sizzle anymore. That argument has been busted. People are seeing through it that there's been, the government of India is reluctant to do an excise cut. Many would say, well, we need that revenue. This is the only avenue that the government of India has to tinker with the excise duty in order to generate revenue. It's a revenue generating model. Let's make no mistake about it. Other thing is the retail price of petrol continued to increase even as the price of crude oil reduced. So today, if we are trying to make an argument that here is the government of India pressurizing the oil-producing countries to reduce crude oil, even when that was reduced, the retail price of petrol continued to increase. After clocking a high in 2011, the crude oil peaked at around $112 per barrel, and the retail price of petrol at that time, interestingly, was 65.76 rupees per litre. In contrast to this, the price of Brent crude oil at present is $84.28 with the retail price of petrol, like we also pointed out, is at 104 rupees per litre in Delhi. So that is just to put things in context, loud and clear, that crude oil prices also started decreasing after 2014, but the retail prices have not witnessed a decline, a commensurate decline. So, Gopal Krishna ji, इस पर आपका क्या रिस्पॉन्स है कि ये तो एक मतलब बहुत कन्वीनियंटली कहा जा रहा है कि क्रूड ऑयल प्राइसेस जिम्मेदार है प्राइस इंक्रीज के लिए, वो सच्चाई से दूर है. वी नो दैट दैट्स फार फ्रॉम द ट्रुथ, मिस्टर गोपाल कृष्णा.
देखिए अफरीदा जी, मैं आपको स्पष्ट शुरू में भी कहा था कि केंद्र सरकार ने ये जो काउंटर साइक्लिकल मेजर्स जिसको कहते हैं, इसका बहुत अच्छी तरह से इस्तेमाल किया था. जब ग्लोबल क्रूड ऑयल प्राइस गिर रहे थे तब इसके ऊपर एक्साइज वगैरह बढ़ाई थी ताकि गवर्नमेंट को जो कोविड से लड़ने के लिए रिसोर्सेज की आवश्यकता है या इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर को बिल्डअप करने के लिए जो रिसोर्सेज की आवश्यकता है वह उसमें से लिया. कॉर्पोरेट टैक्सेस एंड इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स दोनों में.
मेरा सिंपल सवाल है सर, द रिटेल जो क्रूड ऑयल प्राइसेस के जब दाम कम हुए थे, व्हेन इट डिक्रीज्ड, व्हाई डिड नॉट द सेंटर पास द बेनिफिट टू द कंज्यूमर? इंक्रीज होता है तो बर्डन कॉमन मैन पे आ जाता है, डिक्रीज होता है तो उसका बेनिफिट कॉमन मैन को क्यों नहीं मिलता? इसका बस जस्ट गिव मी अ सिंपल आंसर टू दिस.
देखिए, इसमें जो आपने एक्साइज और वैट दोनों लगाते हैं स्टेट और सेंटर में, और जो सेंटर जो एक्साइज लगाता है वो रिसोर्स जनरेट होते हैं. अगर 35 लाख करोड़ के रिसोर्स जनरेट हो रहे हैं केंद्र सरकार के ऊपर और वह केवल कोविड में 30 लाख करोड़ का पैकेज दे रहा है और इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पे स्पेंड कर रहा है, तो रिसोर्स तो कहीं से जनरेट करने पड़ेंगे. अब केंद्र सरकार स्टेट्स गवर्नमेंट्स को भी अपने सेंट्रल पूल में से लगभग 42% का रिसोर्स देता है. तो
जब उनके ऊपर भी टैक्स रखते हैं और सेंटर से भी उन्हें पैसे आते हैं, तो मैं मानता हूं कि इसमें स्टेट गवर्नमेंट्स को ज्यादा इसकी जिम्मेदारी है कि वो वैट को कम करें. सेंटर तो कर ही रहा है, और मैंने आपको बताया जब सेंटर ने ये 10 रुपए और 5 रुपए कम किए तो इसलिए कि डायरेक्ट टैक्स कलेक्शन और इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स जीएसटी कलेक्शन बढ़ गया. जैसे जैसे इकोनॉमी रिवाइव करेगी, टैक्स कलेक्शन बढ़ेगा, तो रिसोर्स जो यहाँ से आ रहे थे उसमें दूसरी जगह से आएंगे, तो केंद्र सरकार
So it just then basically comes down to pehle aap. It's basically comes down to we have done this. Now you do your bit. The center state. I don't want to get into that because today we are looking at a larger issue here. Because I want to understand that how this move is going to help us. But I will allow Ami Yagnik to respond to it. Are you convinced by what Mr. Gopal Krishna ji just said? Okay, very quickly, finish your point, sir. I'll take a response from the Congress spokesperson.
देखिए, सरकार ने इन्फ्लेशन को भी देखना है, अर्थव्यवस्था की ग्रोथ को भी देखना है, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर डेवलपमेंट के इन्वेस्टमेंट को भी देखना है, जन कल्याणकारी योजनाओं का, सोशल वेलफेयर स्कीम्स का डायरेक्ट बेनिफिट ट्रांसफर के अनुसार किसानों के लिए, मजदूरों के लिए, रूरल हाउसिंग के लिए इस समय भी पैसा देना है. तो इकोनॉमी में जब सोचा जाता है व्यापक रूप से, समग्रता से consolidated रूप में देखा जाता है. And we cannot just see an aspect of the resource generation is only issue, expenditure is all important issue, center का द्वारा the states को जो fund transfer है, that is also an important issue. So we are taking the best use of resources which are being generated from the source where we can generate them.
Okay.
और आज
Okay.
not
So
only
you are
Indian,
admitting that this
Indian economies,
is a
but
revenue
globally it is
generating
being
model and we are
accepted.
putting it to good use. Ami Yagnik.
See, first of all, I think the crux of the matter they will never answer. So we do not want to go into debate with that. When the crude oil prices dropped, the prices should have dropped, the fuel prices in the country, but they did not. Post 2014, if you see the increase in the fuel price, it's almost gone over 200%. And despite bringing the comparisons that the oil barrel prices were so and so at a particular point of time, during our time, we gave this much fuel price to the people of this country. And now when the crude prices, oil prices have crashed, why have you increased it so much? But there was never a satisfactory answer. And the government did not think that it should give any answer to the people of this country. First point. Second point, that there's a state tax structure and there's a central tax structure. You have the excise duty, and then you do not want to talk about how you are going to make that change or make some structural change in this pricing mechanism. No debate on that, no inputs on that, and you all the time blame certain states, and you have already bifurcated that these are NDA rule states and these are Congress rule states, but the country is one. The people who are staying in this country are one. They are consuming this fuel. The prices
But Ami
are given
Yagnik,
by the
let's
central
face it,
government.
there's a lot of
Why
duplicity
can't you
in this.
think on this
If the
line?
Congress and the BJP wants, the petroleum products can be brought under GST. Am I right or no? Because from what I understand, and my research has given me this point, which I want to actually put out here, that UPA currently rules 6 states, BJP rules 16 states. The GST Council needs 20 states to pass a resolution. If the voting is required, BJP and Congress rule in 22 states together. So if the BJP and the Congress come together, petroleum products can be brought under GST. That would regulate, that would help bring down the prices. Am I right in this? Let's quickly get the economists to respond to this issue. Mr. Saket Mishra?
Afrida, I think your analysis is absolutely spot on. It can be brought into GST with those numbers that you talked about. But in reality, the issue is actually non-political. It's actually numbers. The fact is, historically, we have had this fuel subsidy. That fuel subsidy had a deficit which was financed in various ways, which needed to be overcome in order for us to actually move forward as a country. So, this simplistic answer that fuel prices came down internationally, therefore it has to be 100% passed, actually doesn't work economically, because some of that has to go back towards making our budget balanced and reducing some of that subsidy bill that we have been carrying from the past.
Okay.
So, so I think, now, and there were obviously some counter-cyclical issues, etc. But clearly there is I think what you have said is absolutely right. There is space for improved efficiency in taxation. I think there are many strong reasons for it to come into GST. I also think that the point Mr. Dua made earlier, which was non-economic, but perhaps very relevant for us, at least looking at 3 to 6 months, is that when the consuming countries come together and they signal this intent, that signal becomes very important, because the fact is that the GCC countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have a multifaceted relationship, to put it sort of diplomatically, with these countries, with the US. And therefore, when the US is giving that signal, I think the ruling regimes in these countries also need to pay attention that the US is serious about this. Now, whether it happens and OPEC actually plays ball is a question. OPEC also is OPEC plus. There's Russia. Russia and China may have their own side interests, but I think there is the seriousness of this measure should not be taken by the numbers, but by the role that this group of countries is going to play. And I think there is hope, because there will definitely be a parallel discussion happening.
Yes, this effort, the importance and seriousness should not be undermined. Ajay Dua, your thoughts on this? And also, I want to just quote from what the government statement says on this decision. The global crude oil prices have risen due to the efforts of Russia and Saudi Arabia. Now that the US has announced the release of oil from reserves, we are cooperating in this step to ensure that crude oil prices remain under control. So that's the official statement, Mr. Dua. Do you relate to it, and do you agree that one must accord this kind of an effort enough importance since it's been done with a certain purpose in mind?
Afrida, I recall that the first time suggestion to make use of the reserves didn't come from the oil-consuming countries. It was made in the month of March this year by the oil producers when the prices were rising. OPEC countries said, you guys who have reserves, why don't you release those into the market? It will steady the prices. And now the action on what was said by them is being taken 8 or 9 months later. So that's number one. Because what they didn't say, reserve, they said, what oil you had purchased at low prices. That is when it was $19 to $20 in the month of April 20. Second point I want to make, and I'll be very quick, GST is a solution, but in the GST, our highest slab rate with the GST Council has agreed is 28%. Whereas the total taxation on petroleum products is over 50, was over 55% till the reduction took place in this month by the central government and the state governments. Central government of these cesses and the state governments of the VAT, it's come down by 5 to 6%. So it is, if everybody even votes for it, it is the governments, I don't think, are ready to take a hit to bring it down from 50% to 28% unless a new slab is created.
Yes.
Politically, that might actually cause more of a problem. Look, only to tax us more. The GST Council has now said there will be a rate of 45% or 48%. So I think this move is both nobody forcing it, while 20 states can get together to get the 2/3 of the votes which are required to pass a resolution. And
Yes.
the GST Council, I think they are going to be dilly-dallying.
Right. So it's not about the Congress or the BJP, whichever party is in power. This is deliberate. That the petroleum products have not been brought under GST. The price control mechanism, depending on when it's happening, different factors are cited. Right now, of course, we are talking about this huge decision that has been taken to dip into India's strategic petroleum reserves. I thank all my guests and panelists for joining us with their informed opinion on the subject. Let's leave it at that for now, but let's remember that this strategic move to rein in spiraling crude prices has got mixed response, like you just heard, but this is supposed to be a diplomatic move as well to send a message to OPEC. It can have short-term impact on domestic fuel prices, though we don't have clarity on it yet. No such announcement made. India becomes part of the so-called oil buyers club with this decision, which is clearly led by the United States to put pressure on OPEC to boost supply. And the next meeting in this regard, even by the OPEC countries, is going to happen on the 2nd of December. We'll watch out for that and we'll keep our viewers updated. Thanks for watching The Urban Debate.